Welcome to Arts Plus Change, hosted by the University of Rochester's Institute for Performing Arts in partnership with the Office of Equity and Inclusion, the Paul J. Burgett Intercultural Center, 540 WMain, Inc., Create a Space Now, Eastman Institute for Music Leadership, the Warner School, and the Rochester Fringe Festival. My name is Ann Harris Wilcox, and my pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm your conference host for this session with Otto Muller. We would like to acknowledge with respect the Seneca Nation, known as the Great Hill People and keepers of the western door of the Haudenosaunee. We take this opportunity to thank the original caretakers on whose ancestral lands the University of Rochester currently resides in Rochester, New York. As we come together, we want to honor the many lives taken too soon in recent events by acknowledging the need for a commitment to constant action and attention surrounding systemic issues that continue to impact each of us every day. While we have encouraged each presenter to make every effort to create brave and safe space, we would like to encourage you to attend these sessions in a way that you need to attend. While we know that discomfort allows for growth, we would like to remind you that you have the agency to make decisions that keep you safe as we embark on potentially difficult content and discussions. As we are all here to learn and grow, we welcome you to challenge ideas, but ask you to agree to challenge the idea and not the person. We want to also remind you that individual presenter views do not necessarily represent the official ideas or beliefs of the University of Rochester, of the Institute for Performing Arts, or its partners. In order to enable live transcription on your Zoom, please click the arrow to the right of the transcript box. That box can be dragged to another location on your screen. We are recording today's session, so please note your spoken written comments or image may be included as well as transcript. In order to be identified by first name only, we invite you to rename your Zoom profile and with your pronouns if you feel comfortable. Breakout rooms will not be recorded. Because we have back-to-back sessions, this session will end promptly on its time, and we encourage presenters and/or participants to share contact information via the chat to foster continued discussion and connection. This cluster will end with this will go right into our 15-minute discussion of all the sessions. So for our social media users out there, please use the hashtag ArtsChange22 if you feel inspired by something you hear or experience this morning. Thank you for joining us. And now I'm honored to welcome Otto Muller, who is presenting socially engaged art as a pedagogical praxis. Take it away.
Thank you so much. So before beginning, I want to say that I'm speaking to you from Nadakina, the unceded homeland of the Abenaki people, and acknowledge their continued stewardship of the land and ongoing struggle for recognition, rights, and sovereignty. I'm speaking to you from Goddard College, a small radical college in Vermont that was founded in 1938 in the belief that democratic education could be an effective countermeasure against fascism, and has continued to be an incubator for experimental education and liberatory politics. So in 2018, I co-designed the BFA in socially engaged art with my colleagues Suyi Wong and Antonio Gonzalez Walker. The three of us have been teaching in an individualized studies program at Goddard for years and wanted to build an arts program that would support students in developing unique interdisciplinary practices in a way that's consistent with the college's legacy of democratic student-centered learning and its commitment to social justice. And so my intention in this talk is to outline some aspects of our design process, and in particular to share the ways that we've approached socially engaged art not as a disciplinary method or an art world discourse, but as a pedagogical praxis, a unique relationship between creative practice, inquiry, and action. So sorry, I'm trying to keep everything open at the same time, and so I'm not going to be able, I don't think I'm going to be able to view the chat as well as the other things. So just like interrupt me if you want to. I'll start with an introduction to socially engaged art, or SEA, as that term has been used within the art world, focusing on some of the questions that it has surfaced around aesthetic and ethical values, and then talk about the way that we think about socially engaged art at Goddard and employ the principles of critical pedagogy to support students undertaking this work. So what is socially engaged art? Accounts of socially engaged art are typically set the scene by describing a range of examples. Maybe Rikrit Tiravanij's Pad Thai, where he cooked food for exhibition visitors and turned the gallery into a social space for strangers to share food and conversation together. Or Agents and Assets, a piece by the Los Angeles Poverty Department, a theater company founded by unhoused people in LA. And in this piece, they support recovering addicts in performing a staged reading of the 1998 House Committee hearing on the CIA's involvement in crack cocaine trafficking. Or Santiago Sierra's 250 centimeter line tattooed on 6 paid people, in which 6 unemployed young men were paid $30 each to stand shoulder to shoulder and have a line tattooed across their backs. A commentary on exploitation that reinscribes its dehumanizing practices. This handful of examples isn't meant to mark the perimeters of this field of socially engaged art, which is also referred to sometimes as social practice or participatory art or littoral art or relational aesthetics, but to offer some snapshots of this body of work that open up questions about how to define it and how to evaluate it. In the 2011 text, Education for Socially Engaged Art, a Materials and Techniques Handbook, which was influential in our own design process, Pablo Helguera acknowledges that all art, in as much as it is created to be communicated to or experienced by others, is social, but specifies that the term socially engaged art, or SEA, refers specifically to a subset of process art, that is, art that makes the experience of its creation a central part of its content, where social interaction is essential to that creative process. He refers to it as, quote, a hybrid multidisciplinary activity that exists somewhere between art and non-art, and its state may be permanently unresolved. In describing how it works, he writes, socially engaged art functions by attaching itself to subjects and problems that normally belong to other disciplines, moving them temporarily into a space of ambiguity. It is this temporary snatching away of subjects into the realm of art making that brings new insights to a particular problem or condition, and in turn makes them visible to other disciplines. This idea of a permanently unresolved state between art and non-art is a great starting point, but when we get into the pedagogical work of supporting students to do it and to do it well, new questions come to the foreground. Questions around assessing socially engaged art, around what matters. Specifically, the question of how to do it well brings up debates around ethical and aesthetic judgment that have surrounded socially engaged art since its emergence in the 90s. The question could be framed like this: should a socially engaged art project be assessed in terms of its positive social impact on affected communities, or should it be evaluated with the same frameworks that are applied to other types of contemporary art? For example, its aesthetic features, its application of technique, its conceptual innovation within an art world discourse, the artist's self-expression, and their success in achieving their own stated goals. Some accounts of socially engaged art simply define the field in terms of an artist's intent to produce a social improvement or benefit. The Helicon Collective's 2017 report, Mapping the Landscape of Socially Engaged Artistic Practice, for example, states that, quote, a working definition of socially engaged art is an artistic or creative practice that aims to improve conditions in a particular community or in the world at large. If socially engaged art is defined in terms of the artist's benevolent aims, an assessment of the work based on the artist's intentions, or one based on the material results, could be the same. In defining arte utile, or useful art, Cuban artist and activist Tania Bruguera goes beyond the idea of artistic intent to focus on concrete outcomes, requiring that the artistic practice offers the people a clearly beneficial result. She writes, For arte utile, failure is not a possibility. If the project fails, it is not arte utile. Artists have the challenge of finding forms in which their proposal may actually work. In contrast to this, Pablo Helguera is explicit in arguing that the benefit of impacted communities should not be seen as either a necessary characteristic or evaluative criterion for socially engaged art, and that an ethical assessment of the artist's choices must not supplant an evaluation of the artistic merits of the work. He writes, to argue, for instance, that socially engaged art creates constructive personal relationships is wrong. An artist's successful project could consist in deliberate miscommunication, in upsetting social relations, or in simply being hostile to the public. This debate belongs to the field of art criticism. In defense of antagonistic and controversial work like the Santiago Sierra tattooed line piece briefly mentioned above, he even goes so far as to say that unethical artistic actions, while crossing the line of acceptability and even legality in some cases, are part of the role that art plays in challenging the assumptions of society. And for that reason, freedom of expression must always be defended. Claire Bishop, who offers an extensive account of socially engaged art in her book, Artificial Hells, Participatory Art and the Politics of Spectatorship, similarly argues that we need aesthetic criteria to assess this work and is critical of a critique that, quote, compares artist projects with other artists on the basis of ethical one-upmanship, the degree to which artists supply a good or bad model of collaboration. She's concerned that puritanical ethics of accountability and praxis undermines the ability of these projects to actually operate as artworks, leveraging the ambiguity and affective power that's unique to aesthetic experience. She writes, the discursive criteria of participatory and socially engaged art is drawn from a tacit analogy between anti-capitalism and the Christian good soul. It is an ethical reasoning that fails to accommodate the aesthetic or to understand it as an autonomous realm of experience. Like Helguera, she argues that artistic freedom, including freedom from these ethical constraints, is necessary to produce truly impactful work, asserting that the most striking, moving, and memorable forms of participation are produced when artists act upon a gnawing social curiosity without the incapacitating restrictions of guilt. So socially engaged art reveals a kind of important disagreement about what matters in artistic practice, a tension between the unfettered ability of art to challenge assumptions in ambiguous, transgressive, and evocative ways, and the responsibility of a creative practice to produce improvements in material conditions through ethical collaborative engagement. And that brings up a really important pedagogical question for us in terms of like, how do we think about artistic freedom? How do we navigate that tension in ways that are creative and critical and generative instead of getting caught choosing a side in this apparent binary of opposing values? To get at that question and offer some insight into the way that we're approaching it at Goddard, I want to share a moment from a panel discussion we held in our inaugural semester of the program. Oops, skipped a quote there. Our panelists included Cyrus Marcus Ware, an amazing activist, visual artist, and organizer out of Toronto, Claire Dolan, a veteran of the Bread and Puppet Theater and the founder of the Museum of Everyday Life, and Dr. H. Harukati Sharif Williams, a member of our own faculty, who's a poet, a documentary filmmaker, applied theater practitioner, and a scholar in decolonial sexuality studies. As a moderator, one of the first questions that I asked was, among all the possible techniques and tactics for achieving liberatory social change, why make art? And Harukati responded, on a personal level, I would say that art is a means for me to come to know and understand and to be and live and love in the world. So that's why I practice art, and I would practice it regardless. I would practice it if we lived in a socially just and ecologically well world. The fact that we don't means some other things. And for me, Black feminist thought has helped. He went on to share something that author and filmmaker Toni Cade Bambara said in a 1982 interview. She said, the task of the artist is determined always by the status and process and agenda of the community that it already serves. if you're an artist who identifies with, who springs from, who is serviced by, or drafted by a bourgeois capitalist class, then that's the kind of writing you do. Then your job is to maintain status quo, to celebrate exploitation, or to guise it in some lovely romantic way. That's your job. As a cultural worker who belongs to an oppressed people, my job is to make revolution irresistible. That quote comes at some of these questions from a different direction. It asserts that all art is socially engaged, that it impacts culture in material ways, but it also makes the point that this impact is not the result of a set of methodological choices that can be decontextualized and packaged in a curriculum, but that the social impact of art emerges from pre-existing systems and structures of accountability. Each student enters the program already acculturated into relationships with social structures, and the college itself is also always already entangled in its own institutional relationship to power and the status quo. Coming back to the discussion about the apparent tension between the value of uninhibited artistic freedom on the one hand and ethical collaboration toward concrete outcomes on the other, Bambara's analysis illuminates the fact that both of these norms are products of social structures, and that the way that any one of us navigates those values has a lot to do with the ways that we're already implicated in existing systems. This is already apparent in Bishop's characterization of ethical responsibility in terms of one-upmanship, guilt, and the Christian good soul, presupposing that the artist's identification is with art world elite and with the paternalistic politics of liberal Christian owning class. If we look more closely, the idea of artistic freedom, of unrestricted gnawing curiosity being the thing that challenges assumptions and moves society forward, this idea can also serve a set of dominant norms committed to universal progress narratives, innovation economies, individualism, and cultural imperialism. When an artist identifies with these dominant norms, is enlisted by them, either set of values has a way of maintaining the status quo. Conversely, for Toni Cade Bambara, her commitment to her own artistic freedom cannot be separated from her accountability to the well-being of the community that she's a member of, as both are made possible only through revolutionary disruptions of a status quo. So it might sound like what I'm saying is that the type of social impact that an artist can have is predetermined by their social identity and location within the matrices of domination. And that's not quite what I'm saying, but I would argue that the work of genuinely disrupting a status quo in ways that improve conditions requires an artist to develop a critical understanding of their own positionality within systems of power and inequity, and to build real relationships of accountability that are based in a grounded understanding of the ways that their own freedom and humanization is tied to the emancipation of others. It's reminiscent of the phrase from the Aboriginal activists in Queensland, if you've come here to help me, you're wasting your time, but if you've come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. From a curricular standpoint, in this program, we therefore locate the foundations of socially engaged art, not with a particular set of techniques or methodologies, and not with a specific art world discourse or catalog of exemplary projects, but in the work of understanding one's own relationship to social structures and communities of accountability through creative, cultural, and aesthetic practices. Luckily for us, there is an educational model that already exists that was built to support this sort of ongoing work and understanding one's relationship to structural oppression. The critical pedagogy of Paulo Freire offers strategies for supporting this type of consciousness, which he terms conscientização or conscientization. Based on his rural literacy work in Brazil, Freire's 1968 text, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, identifies the way in which a banking model of education premised on the idea of a static body of knowledge that's transferred from experts to students reinforces authoritarian dynamics. And in response, he invites teachers and students to come together and grapple with real world problems to co-construct knowledge through ongoing dialogue. idea of co-intentionality and collective liberation is central to critical pedagogy. Freire writes, quote, authentic help means that all who are involved help each other mutually, growing together in the common effort to understand the reality which they seek to transform. Only through such praxis, in which those who help and those who are being helped help each other simultaneously, can the act of helping become free from the distortion in which the helper dominates the helped. This term praxis refers to the idea of applying and testing learning in real situations, to the way that our ever-growing understanding of the world and its inequities calls upon us to work together to change it. Scholar and social critic Bell Hooks writes, again and again, Freire has had to remind readers that he never spoke of conscientization as an end in itself, but always as it is joined by meaningful praxis. It always astounds me when progressive people act as though it is somehow a naive moral position to believe that our lives must be a living example of our politics. Freirean scholar Antonio Darder points to the role that love plays, both in making learning a fundamentally humanizing experience and in building relationships of care and accountability that demand action. She writes, Paulo urged for the development of emancipatory consciousness through a critical pedagogy of love that requires our ongoing participation and co-creation as cultural citizens who know that we are in the world to change the world. Acknowledging the role of love allows us to move away from the type of abstract and puritanical ethics that Bishop was critical of, and into a more unfettered passion toward collective liberation and irresistible revolution. Darder writes, for ultimately the purpose of a pedagogy of love is to uncompromisingly disrupt the logic of oppression by posing new questions and solutions generated from the cultural worldviews and lived histories of the excluded, exploited, and oppressed. For it is through such an ethics of liberation that we break our dependence on the logic of conquest and work collectively to create an emancipatory praxis as educators, cultural workers, and movement activists, uncompromisingly committed to the revolutionary belief that another world is possible. So many working within the field of socially engaged arts have identified the relevance of critical pedagogy in the work of Paulo Freire. Both Helguera and Bishop, for example, write about these parallels. And many socially engaged artists acknowledge that, quote, it is necessary that artists and art collectives be conscious of power dynamics, particularly when working in conflict of affected and marginalized communities. But this attitude doesn't always take the same ardor as it doesn't emphasize the role of love and collective liberation with the same power that's expressed in Freire, Hooks, and Darder. So in building a curriculum for socially engaged art, we've really tried to create an arts pedagogy that has at its center the Freirean principles of conscientization, dialogue, and praxis. That built upon that as its foundation and centers an ethics of liberation and revolutionary possibility. So some of the main features of this are a decolonial social and ecological justice framework, a project-based learning model, low residency format, dialogic mentorship, narrative assessment, and collaborative group study. So every student in their first semester takes part in a seminar that uses a framework from Pokalainui essay, Processes of Decolonization, to interrogate their own relationship to remembrance, embodiment, dream, commitment, and change, and to engage with a wide range of authors, bringing diverse perspectives, including from anti-colonial theory, Black feminist thought, class analysis, and queer theory. So this provides students with a shared foundation in conscientization and ontological difference, and opens up challenging conversations about the different and sometimes contradictory ways that we frame the idea of justice. And that's not just within the BFA in socially engaged art, that's every undergraduate student at Goddard has that introductory seminar that they do together. There's a project-based learning model. So the core of the program is individualized project-based learning that the student co-creates with a faculty mentor and develops through ongoing dialogue throughout the semester. At the beginning of each semester, there's a week-long intensive where students meet daily with their faculty advisor to design a number of projects that they'll undertake during the semester and to identify the research and resources that they'll incorporate, the studio practices and activities that they'll engage in to develop new skills and techniques, and the communities that they'll engage in through this work, as well as the media that they'll use to document their learning. And over the course of the semester, they exchange work with their advisor, receiving regular feedback throughout that process. It's a low residency program, so students are only on campus during the first week of the semester and spend the bulk of their time living and working within their own community, which makes it possible for students to initiate and sustain projects that are embedded in the communities they already inhabit, instead of shaping their projects around like the artificial and temporary community that is a college campus. Praxis, or the application of theory and transforming the world, requires sustained relationships of accountability, not just, you know, parachuting in and hopping back out. The feedback that students receive is dialogic, is about producing and sustaining dialogue. Each student has a primary advisor that they work with throughout the semester. And the ongoing dialogue allows time and space necessary for genuine humanizing relationships of care and accountability to emerge. So the students' project-based work might evolve and change direction throughout the semester in response to new learning. And when accountability is grounded in human connection instead of a set of transactional and contractual agreements, then the learning is much more agile and responsive to discovery. There are no grades. Students receive a narrative assessment from their advisor, and they also write their own narrative assessment at the end of each semester. And then we also have collaborative group studies. As mentioned above, the majority of the work that students do in the program is self-directed project-based learning. We don't really have courses, but given the importance of collective engagement, BFA students are also regularly involved in group studies that can operate either like seminars around a relevant topic, ongoing workshops in applied techniques, spaces to workshop and critique work in progress, or as collaborative, creative or curatorial projects. The group studies offer students opportunities to grapple with challenging ideas in conversation with artists who have very different lived experiences and disciplinary backgrounds. So it's a totally interdisciplinary program. We've got students ranging from like painters to dancers to circus artists to comic book artists to electronic music producers, the whole gamut, but coming together to grapple with this set of questions around conscientization and the instrumental use of art and change. So as a brief introduction of the key features of the program, but I hope it's sufficient too to see the ways that it's not built around the idea of offering like prepackaged training in a particular methodology of social engagement or facilitated community participation. And it's not about acculturating students into this specific art world discourse around performance art, concept art, participatory art, the examples that I started with. But instead it's about building a framework that supports community, that supports conversation and conscientization, and that cultivates an understanding of art as, to use Harukati's words again, a means to come to know and understand and be and live and love in the world. Or it's a way to make art a laboratory for liberation, the type of freedom that we do together. So that's my spiel. That's my talk. I realize it is not lost on me the irony of giving like a lengthy talk on dialogue without, you know, having a conversation. So that's sharing some of the dialogue that I've been having in my head with the words of people like Pablo Helguera and Claire Bishop and Paola Freire and Tony Cade Bombara. But I would love to have a conversation with you all too. So I'll shut that down so I can see your faces. Hey, um, so I welcome any questions. It's totally a work in progress. I tell the student every semester, we meet as a group, we huddle like all the students and faculty, and I tell them straight up, like, this is a work in progress. What's working for you? What isn't? What do we need to do differently? What group studies do you want next semester? We have those conversations. But I'm also, another thing that I'm annoyed by the limitations of a community that's defined by people who are financially entangled in it, either being paid as faculty and staff or paying into it as students. And so I'm always excited in thinking of it as a project that expands beyond those entanglements of capital, and like having it be a broader conversation too. So having, from this brief introduction too, I'm curious, like, who y'all are, what you're doing, and how this weird little revolutionary art program in Vermont could actually be of service to you. You know what I mean? Like, how can we connect in ways that help you in doing the work that you're doing in the communities that you're accountable to?
Yeah, this is amazing. Sorry, Anne. I'll just say I have been aware of Goddard's program a little bit. We know we have someone in our community who went there as a MFA, I think, or whatever the master's program is. But I didn't know it was also undergraduate in the same ways. So even the undergraduate is low res. Amazing. And
Yeah.
is it only the art program, or is it the whole of the college?
The entire college is low residency.
Amazing. It's truly amazing. Like, the model is incredible. And I think you probably know I'm running the program of dance and movement at University of Rochester. And we have lots of community engaged coursework. We have a lot of interest in this area, but we are in the constraints of a more typical semester-long course and, courses per se and all of that kind of thing. However, there are some opportunities where we're able to have courses that don't necessarily take place on campus or within the framework of the semester. And yeah, so I would be definitely curious to see where there might be some synergies. And I purchased that first socially engaged art book that you were talking about for my current course, because I thought it was going to be more kind of like how to, and it wasn't exactly what I was looking for, but it was informative. I just loved the quote, which was longer, but I kind of loved taking out the part, "My job is to make revolution irresistible." It was Tony K. Bambara's quote. I don't know. I just think what you're sharing with us is not instigating, but like inspiring and instigating in the same positive way. But I'll let other people speak.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
I'm coming from the same place as Missy, because I work at the dance and movement and faculty, and very much involved with community engaged learning. But the model that you have seems to be the way we need to proceed to make it as way more effective than what we're able to do. I feel like there's always an emphasis on a deliverable, for instance, and working within the framework. I'm curious if some of your projects, spill over into not necessarily the time constraints that are normally, the semester long, or if I don't think I heard you speak about that, but I was curious if that happened. And the low res part is, of course, makes sense. You take back all these thoughts to where you are. And I also think they probably have more investment, personal livelihood investment in where they're coming from as well. So that engagement, but the notion of the deliverable being building a relationship, I feel like that is what we miss, that there sometimes has to be an end performance, an end mural, an end, something. And I love that your program probably does that already. It probably naturally does it, but it's not the emphasis. I wondered if you could speak about the deliverability of what you do.
Yeah, and I'm sure Jane could too, because Jane's a graduate who's joining us. Hey, Jane, good to see you. Seeing you too makes me think too that like one of the interesting deliverables too, I think, of doing the work around conscientization is that oftentimes the college is not in the place of saying, get the thing done, you know what I mean? But the college is in the place of saying, whoa, hold up. Like, I see that you wanted to take on this project and you want to get this thing done in this community, but like, let's take a step back and like unpack some of the things about, your own relationship to the dynamics that you're dealing with here before you dive in and start like making work in the streets. And so I feel like that's a really, that in some ways, our role at the college is actually stepping between the student and the deliverable to say like, oh, there's this other work that also needs to be a part of this. And I don't know, do you want to speak to that, Jane? Or
I can. Goddard's program was life-changing is all I can really put the emphasis on. And Otto's right. I was very, very aggressive and excited to just jump in and be a socially engaged artist and change the world. And the brakes were applied. I was able to more authentically settle into who I am and what that means and how it connects with other people and finding commonality. I have found that my work in the community is so much more deep and just resonates to my soul. I've got 4 huge projects going on right now, and it never would have happened, I don't think, if I hadn't undertaken the course of study and worked with these wonderful people at Goddard. And yes, projects, I had one project, the Hard Apples project for homeless students, that went over all 3 semesters, because it was the getting it done, the negotiating, the finding the people that can make it work, and then, embedding it into different social environments to get the project done. So it's never like, wait, haven't you finished that yet? It wasn't like that at all. It was just like, you've made progress here. Think about this. That's all.
Yeah, thank you, Jane. And I think it's great to be, and this is not like, I should say to, like any other institution, there's plenty of friction between administration and faculty, and, it's not some sort of utopian whatever, but it's wonderful to be in a pedagogical structure where like, when things come up and it's like, oh, I was at a meeting at this, community center, and some people brought up some questions about who's involved in this project, and that's going to slow it down because like other people are getting involved and like to be in a position where instead of being like, oh, well, you only have 4 weeks left, to be able to be like, well, this is actually how social engagement works. It's about being in for the long haul. And it's about, it can support students in doing work that's not only not limited to a semester, but that's not limited to their undergraduate degree. And there are plenty of students who are in their senior year are developing work that they're going to continue for the next 3-4 years. But they're incubating that project and they're, doing the groundwork for it. And they don't need to bring it to a state of completion for us to say, yeah, you're doing the work,
It makes total sense. And the thing with this, you know, arts plus change, the reimagining is where, you know, you've imagined this, you've made it a reality. I feel like we're still so bound at our other universities by this. It must all get down to finances. Honestly, that's, you know, basically what's happening. But we have to be able to see a different structure, because the things that we're suggesting that make meaningful connection with the community, with the resources that the universities can offer and learn from each other, just take time. They just don't fit into a box. Sometimes they work in a semester if you're lucky, but nothing's sustainable. So I really love knowing that, well, Goddard does it. So let's make something not maybe exactly like Goddard, but how can we shape something that can be more effective than what we've got?
And I can't agree more that it takes time. And so like in our case, I think the sustainable piece is the professor, the faculty member. But that only goes so far, especially when you're really trying to create, you know, like dismantle power structures and things like that. Like you know, it's, yeah, we have to work within these systems, right? And here we are, like, we're trying to do this thing. It's still a conference, but we're not charging people. You know, like we're trying to dismantle the system, but here we are, like, still kind of following the system, right? It's like, so yeah.
Yeah, there's with I don't have it in front of me, but there's that Fred Moten quote, the only relationship to have with higher education today is a criminal one. But he, you know, where he I don't know, we talk at Goddard, I mean, Goddard has a long history of being kind of anti-establishment. And you know, I'll say too, that's costly. I mean, we burn through administrations like nobody's business, and you know, it makes it difficult for us to actually think long-term as an institution, because we're always kind of chewing on our own limbs. You know, because in a way that I think is consistent with some of our philosophies, but you know, also creates its own issues. But from the perspective of the BFA, I mean, we certainly have a lot of conversations around like the idea of infiltration, the idea of agitation, the idea of like being fluent with discourses, being able to enter into institutional space and know the rules of like legibility and how to make your work legitimate in different spaces and different sorts of terrain, because those are the tools that you need to be able to create change in those areas. So I think like what you're talking about, Missy, in terms of like always having to play a double game, you know, I think that's the terrain that we're living in. And I love the Harukati's quote too, which is to say, like, even if we weren't in that terrain and we didn't need to fight that fight, we'd still be making art. You know what I mean? But because we're making art in the world we're making it in, we also have to like do something. We also have to be, you know, playing those games as well. Cool. Oh, yeah. And I saw you on mute.
No, I was just going to say we have about 2 minutes. So however you want to spend it.
Yeah. So what I wanted to say, if people could, I mean, I guess if people wanted to throw contact information in the chat, or I'll put mine in the chat too. If you want to reach out to, like I said before, I'm really interested in the ways that this work can be, you know, something that's not just held by institutions, and the way that we can, you know, contribute to, you know, form networks, form communities that are bigger than that. So I would love to reach out to everybody and be in touch, and maybe like we have Zoom now, we're all used to Zoom. Hop on Zoom and start, you know, planning the revolution.
Exactly. And Missy, will we be sharing a contact list with the, was that something that was
We,
approved of, or?
we're sharing the contact list among presenters, but not necessarily with all of the participants, right? So, yeah, so this is a great way to do it.
Great. Well, thank you, Otto. That was just so wonderful to learn about, to think about these new approaches to education and possibilities with community engagement and art. Amazing. I'm